direct your attention to our card. Sign language interpreters are available for any speaker in our series as long as the wide is a couple of days' notice. If you know someone who would like those services, please inquire at our front desk. Friday Forum is rebroadcast on WEP 90.1 Community Radio or Manor Public Television, and we also live stream the talks, which then go on YouTube. So you have lots of, if you ever miss one, you have lots of options to catch it later. After the presentation, we'll begin a question and answer period using this remote microphone. You do have to hold the microphone very close to your mouth in order for everyone to hear you. Please do that. We appreciate your cooperation. If you need to leave at any time during this presentation for class or another reason, please feel free to discreetly slip out. Speaking of people who are here for class or other reasons, if you need to get credit for being here, please make sure that you sign in on our sign-in sheet. Or if you would like to receive emails about this and other programs at the Y, we encourage you to sign in. I will be circulating one of those, and there's always one at our welcome table. And with that, I'd like to invite Emily Cross, the Y's Development Director, to make a brief announcement and introduce today's speaker.
Thank you, Casey. Hi, everybody. I told Casey that today's topic was very apropos for my little announcement because even though we're going to be learning today about special interests and large sums of money, we at the Y are relying on generous donations of individual supporters like yourselves. And so I just wanted to make a quick plug. We are launching our annual fund drive this fall. Our goal is to raise $145,000. And that is in large part to help pay for the staff that put on these fantastic programs and also pay for the fantastic speakers that we have because we would like to have the experts come and talk to you all at Friday Forum. So if you are a faculty or staff at the university or a retiree or even a graduate student, the Campus Charitable Fund Drive is going on right now through November 11th. We have some information at the welcome table about how you can designate to the University YMCA when you make your gift. We do so. So thank you so much to everybody who's given so far, and I just encourage you to support these great programs. And with that, I'm going to introduce our speaker, Mr. Trevor Gervais, is the lead organizer with Common Cause, Illinois, where he works with members across the state to build a diverse community engagement program that fights to reduce the influence of money in politics and expand voting rights. He also manages the state's digital outreach and communication efforts. Before joining Common Cause Illinois in June 2015, Trevor held the post of Regional Field Director and Get Out the Vote Director during President Obama's re-election campaign. During his time there, he oversaw the registration of more than 12,000 new voters, which is pretty amazing, and the highest district level turnout in decades. He's also worked at the local level to decrease class sizes and increase student representation with school boards. Trevor previously spent a summer working at the White House with the Office of Intergovernmental Affairs. Trevor holds 2 bachelor's degrees from the University of Arizona in political science and Latin American studies. Please join me in welcoming Trevor Gervais.
Can everyone hear me okay? Yes. Perfect. So my name is Trevor Gervais. I'm the lead organizer of Common Cause Illinois. Today we're really here to talk about money in politics, the influence that it has, and some of the more recent issues that have popped up, as well as the connection of money in politics to some of the other issues that a lot of us care about, voter access and many other issues. But before I start, I know, and thank you for the brief introduction, but I just want to start a little bit by talking about how I got involved in this work and how important I think it is for people to be involved. So as the organizer, my #1 job with Common Cause Illinois is working with people across the state to get more active in their communities, to be able to hold power accountable and fight for the issues that really matter to them. This is important to me because I remember the first kind of organizing experience that I ever had was back in high school. And I went to high school in Phoenix, Arizona, and we had high school classes with 40 to 45 students in them, with only 38 to 39 desks. And so we were actually in a situation where the fire marshal wouldn't allow more desks into the classroom, but the district kept putting more students in there. So students, including myself, would sit on the floor in the back of the room, would be standing in the back of the room for a 90-minute class period. And at one point, some of my friends and myself got together and just realized, well, we have a governing board. We've never, met them. We've never gone to the district, but we know we have one. We know that they have regular meetings. We just don't ever go to them. And so what we did was we decided that we were going to try it. And so we got 50 people together, and we showed up to a meeting that normally only 2 or 3 people show up to. And that was the start of a 3 or 4 month campaign to secure a class size maximum. And through getting hundreds of students involved in an area where community organizing is certainly not a part of the culture, we were able to get that class size maximum of 35, which is not what it should be, but is a great step in the right direction. And since then, everything that I've kind of been working on has been getting people involved to really to realize their power within their communities and to get more involved. Particularly in local politics, where frequently it's the people who show up that are making the decisions. And when not a lot of people show up, that's why they can make those decisions. So I'm going to jump right into it. Before I talk anything about this, raise your hand if you've ever heard of common cause before. Okay, so if you look around the room, you'll see there's an age gap in who has heard of common cause before and who has not. So I had never heard of it before I started as lead organizer about a year and a half ago. But I knew that money in politics matters to me, that voting rights matters to me. And the biggest reason that I knew that was because after working as regional field director for President Obama's re-election campaign in southern Arizona and then field director in central Las Vegas, I was so inspired and passionate about the number of people that came together. It was hundreds of people who've never been involved in the political process, coming out, registering people to vote, getting more involved in the process. And then we won on election day, and then everybody went home. And that was it. Some of those people stayed involved, but of the 300 or 400 volunteers that we helped to organize in that area alone, I would probably say 3 or 4 are really still involved at this point. And that is what kind of led me to Common Cause. I like the idea of a nonpartisan organization and a nonprofit organization that is focusing on some of these issues and help people get involved in the long term. We see it every single year, and we're starting to see it right now, only a month out from the election. I think it's something like 40 days now. We're seeing people get very, very involved, and what I don't want to see is a month after the election, everybody staying home. So, Common Cause has been around since 1970 as a national organization. It was founded back in 1970 by John Gardner with the simple idea that everybody was organized in DC except for the people. Everybody had a lobby, except there was no people's lobby. And so Common Cause was founded with the idea of being a people's lobby. We have 625,000 members nationwide, including 22,000 active members in the state of Illinois. And that includes all parts of the state, so obviously, and it breaks down basically by population. So we have a lot of Chicago members, but certainly all throughout the state as well. We are active in about 35 states with staff in 22 of those states. We have about 80 staff nationwide that are working on all of our issues, everything from redistricting to money in politics and voting rights. Here in Illinois, what we really focus on are 3 things: elections and voting, which is very relevant right now; money in politics, which has unfortunately been relevant for a long time. It doesn't look like it's going anywhere. In terms of being an issue for us, and just general accountability. This is making sure that people are held accountable, making sure that everyday Illinoisans have the opportunity to actually go and talk to an elected official, feel like they're heard and how they're really impacting the process. But what I'm really here to talk about today is Citizens United. And I'll just kind of preface all of this with, I have a relatively short presentation. The whole thing is a little under 30 minutes, so we can leave lots of time open for questions at the end. So please, if you have some, keep them in your head, because we really want to get to those. Raise your hand if you have heard of Citizens United before. So that gets way more people than Common Cause. Citizens United was a 2010 Supreme Court case, and it was brought by this organization called Citizens United that wanted to air, it was actually an anti-Secretary Clinton, at the time, Senator Clinton, ad during a normal broadcast period. And essentially, there are a lot of different pieces of it. It touches on McCain-Feingold and all these other more kind of convoluted pieces of legislation. But what it essentially did was open the floodgates for money to go into elections, and particularly into super PACs. So when I say super PAC, I'm talking about a nonprofit organization that comes together and does not have to report where the money comes from, does not have to say exactly what they're doing, but can influence elections in a huge way. There are certain restrictions, so for example, they're not supposed to coordinate with candidates. But we see that happening all the time. They're not supposed to give directly to candidates, but when, as we'll talk about in a little bit, we'll see cases where over $100 million is raised and spent in favor of a candidate, whether they're coordinating or not, clearly they're helping the candidate. Whether they're giving that money directly to the candidate or not, it's very clear what they're doing. So the 2010 Supreme Court case came out, and 2012 was the first election that we really saw a large number of super PACs in the presidential cycle. And between Romney and Obama, what we saw was just a huge amount of both sides. And this is one thing that I think people get wrong a lot. And obviously, I told my background, so while I have some personal partisan affiliations, I'm really here in a nonpartisan capacity. And what we can see is that as Democrats and Republicans see a huge amount of spending by 501c4 for super PACs. In 2016, I just bring this up because it is 2016, and it was such a relevant example. Governor Bush, when he was running, if you remember, he was pretty low in the polls for a very long time. He did not gain traction, and he eventually dropped out. He would have had to drop out a lot earlier, but he had raised $121 million in super PAC money. And there were a lot of smaller candidates who were able to raise a lot of super PAC money as well that kept them afloat. Now the problem here is that you'll have certain candidates who it was clear that the voters did not want that person to remain involved in the process, right? Like you would have a lot who were getting 1% or 2%, but because a few very wealthy individuals had funded their super PAC, then they were able to stay involved and keep kind of pushing the message for a very long time. And so that was one of many examples that we've seen so far, where people with an extreme amount of money are able to have far more of an influence than everyday Americans and Illinoisans in these processes. I wrote down coordination because I think that's really important. A lot of the time what people will say is, well, these super PACs are okay because they're not allowed to coordinate directly with candidates, it's more about education. The problem is there aren't really clear guidelines on coordination, and so I'll bring back to Governor Bush, which I was picking on him earlier. He was in a situation where he had not declared for president yet, but everybody knew he was running for president. People don't just for fun go to all of the swing states and spend more time in Iowa than they've ever spent in their entire life leading up to an election just for fun. They're doing it because they're running for president. But because he hadn't technically declared it, they were able to coordinate directly with the group that was about to spend over $100 million on his behalf. And so there's clear coordination happening in all of these cases. And even when there's not, you look at such a substantial amount of money that it's very, very difficult to find cases where small organizations are ever able to actually defeat a few very, very large donors. A couple of good examples. I was just talking about this earlier. The Koch brothers, which we don't hear as much about anymore, but certainly have not gone anywhere, are just some good examples of this. So the ALEC, which is the American Legislative Exchange Council, is an organization that's funded by the Koch brothers, among other large donors. And essentially what they do is that they take a large amount of money and use it to put together legislation that is pushing their agenda, and then they push it in all 50 states across the country. And so what we're seeing is that two people who are extremely wealthy are able to have a huge impact on some of the different pieces of legislation with ideas that did not come from the state, they did not come from the constituents of that state, but instead were brought in from a certain organization which can then go and through other means fund candidates and keep them involved in that way. Here in Illinois, we have no shortage of cases of the issues that we have with money in politics. We see a number of issues. Again, I put two people up there who are from different parties because it's not a one-party issue. Governor Romney spent over $40 million of his own money running for governor. That was more money than was ever spent in a gubernatorial race. And what we know is that he could have spent 10 times that. He didn't, but he could have spent 10 times that, and there wouldn't have been anything to limit him from doing that. Mayor Emanuel also is, when you look at his finances, pulls from a large number of donors, many of which are out of state, many of which are outside of the city of Chicago, and you'll see fundraisers happening in California and New York for Chicago. And so it's very easy to kind of connect some of the dots between each of these and the influence that it is having. There are a lot of different solutions and a lot of different ideas that people have. Certainly we have not fixed the issue yet. There are a lot of great organizations working on this, and it's not just common cause. But I want to run through some of the things that have either already happened or that groups are proposing. I'll kind of run through and give you my thoughts on them, but I'd love to come back to this in the Q&A section and hear what you guys think. One of them would be a constitutional amendment. So the only real way to get around the Supreme Court decision, either the Supreme Court rehear it, which does not happen all that frequently, or there can be a constitutional amendment. So either you have 2/3 of the House and Senate, or 2/3 of the states come together and say, we want this specific language put onto the Constitution, which would say, which could reverse the Citizens United hearing. We have seen constitutional amendments obviously happen many times in this country, and I actually, we don't see that as a huge problem, right? If it's drafted well, it can really help limit the influence of money in politics. And so the constitutional amendment, we believe, is an effective way to do that. You'll also hear a lot of people talk about a constitutional convention. So this is not something that has happened in a very, 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 very long time. But it is written into the Constitution that if 2/3 of the states come together and call for a constitutional convention, then there can be a constitutional convention. There are a number of problems with that. So at I'm going to abbreviate it to CONCON because that's what a lot of people call it. I also like the name CONCON because it's pros and cons, and I think this is a bad idea. So in a CONCON, the issue is that when we have a constitutional convention, everything is up for grabs. Anything can happen. And when we look at the influence that money politics has right now, the idea that money politics wouldn't have influence at a constitutional convention, that doesn't make any sense. Of course, they're going to have a large influence. Of course, big money interests are going to pour huge amounts of money into that process. We also don't really have a lot of structures in place because there aren't examples of constitutional conventions in modern history. So it says there's going to be a representative from each different state, but there's not always clarity about who exactly that would be. So who are we sending? Is it the governor? Is it someone who's appointed by the state legislature? It can be different in different states. But the most important issue is that we walk into there thinking that it's a great idea because it's a great way to rewrite portions of the Constitution in order to limit the influence of money in politics, but it could also limit the right for people to vote. It could limit any other number of issues that we hear kind of argued throughout in Congress and in presidential debates, and it would do it behind closed doors. It would do it without votes of average constituents, and it would do it frankly without really any input. Certainly states could try and put it in the process, but there's no requirement for that. This was, obviously when this was first put in place, it was just delegates from different states, and they were at the time colonies, and they were able to make whatever decisions that they wanted to. So we have huge concerns with the Constitutional Convention. There are several states who have already made strides to actually have a Constitutional Convention. Illinois is one of them. So Illinois has already passed the state legislature calling for one of these. If we were to get anywhere near the number necessary, we would start as an organization working very hard in Illinois just to have that repealed to make sure that this wouldn't happen. The next two ideas I like because they're already happening, and so we have some clear examples to point to, and they're clean elections and fair elections. So the clean elections program is really interesting because it has this idea, and I'm going to speak from experience because we have a system like this in Arizona where I grew up. Essentially, you have to collect $5 donations from a large number of people. So it depends on which office you're running for. Let's say you have to collect $5 from 1,000 different people. Everybody can give $5, or almost everybody can give $5, so it's a very inclusive way to do it. And once you collect that amount of money, you're given a large sum of public money that you can then use to run your campaign. It's been very successful in the states that it's done in, but it does not work everywhere. So we looked at it as an example for Chicago, and it would not work in Chicago because of the cost that it takes to run for office. It would actually be interesting to see in some of the small municipalities across Illinois where it might be more of a reality. But for example, Tucson, Arizona, which is home of the University of Arizona, has been, when you look at all of their city council candidates, their candidates for mayor, for state representative, and for state senator, almost every single person running for office runs through this program. And I had never donated to a political candidate before, and I did when it was $5 because I knew not only it was $5 something that's feasible for me to give, but I knew that it would actually have a real impact. It was going to give them enough money to run a competitive campaign, and that's really the goal of this program. So we've seen many different states put that in place. I just used Arizona as an example. And then the other model is the fair elections program. And before kind of going through the training to describe what the fair elections program is, I actually just want to show you guys a video of this that we put together, a short animation, because the fair elections is one of our priority campaigns that we're working on in Chicago to get money out of politics.
Republicans overwhelmingly agree there is way too much money in politics. About $7 billion was spent in the 2012 presidential race, and here in Chicago, over $40 million was spent on the 2015 mayoral election alone. But it doesn't have to be this way. All across the country, from New York to Los Angeles, cities have implemented a new campaign finance system that gives every voter a real voice. This system is called Fair Elections, and it creates a small donor match program that levels the playing field for voters trying to make their voices heard. Here's how it works. Right now, small donations from everyday Americans are dropped out by massive checks written by wealthy donors and big special interests. If we pass fair elections, every donation up to $175 will be matched 6 times. This means that your $175 donation becomes $1,050. Candidates who receive matching funds will also be required to only accept small donations, limiting the influence of extremely wealthy donors. In 2015, there was a ballot question asking voters whether or not they would support a small donor match system. Almost 80% of Chicago voters supported the question, creating a mandate for change. The time has come to turn the will of the people into the law of the land. Head to fairelectionsil.com and learn how you can help get big money out of politics.
For sure, yeah. Did anyone recognize who was
Bill
Gervais. From why we don't tell me. Put together that piece for us, or this audio from it. So, with local fair elections and the clean election system, the idea is to get candidates to opt into a program where they are going to be restricted from taking big money. Because of that Supreme Court decision, there is no legal option that cities and states have to stop people from taking money from super PACs, to stop people from taking different, up to the limit of, I don't know what it is here in Chicago, I think it's $5,200 per election, so $10,400 for the actual full election between the primary and the general. These are programs that incentivize small donations and then make it so that people are not allowed to take donations over a certain amount. So for the clean elections program, you can't take more than $5 from anyone. And you collect those $5 donations, and once you collect them all and you get your big check, then you're done. You don't raise any more money. You have to make that last. But the fair elections program is a little bit different, and it works really well in more expensive races. So New York City has had the system for more than 30 years. Los Angeles has had it for about 20 years, so it's clearly been tried and tested and improved over the years. The idea being, like I said in the video, is that if you are going to set a limit, which we did in a Chicago ordinance for $175, you opt into the program, you say, you know, I won't take donations over a certain amount, it's $500 for this one, and the $175 will be matched 6 times. So from now on, you can raise $175 at a time or less, and it will be matched 6 times, and you'll suddenly be able to actually run a viable campaign. Right now, an issue that we have, particularly in larger cities, isn't that people aren't running with small money, it's that nobody's winning with small money. People can't be competitive by raising $5 or $10 or $15 at a time, because you're going to spend your whole campaign raising $20 at a time, someone's just going to get a $10,000 check from their friend, done. You're not going to be able to up that, because they're going to do that 30, 40, 50 more times. There are all many races in Chicago that cost upwards of $800,000 just by the fact that it's a relatively small election. We see also at the statewide level, so State Representative Ken Duncan just had the most expensive re-election effort, which was not successful, but raised more than $5 million, much of which came from out of state. And the only reason that he was not successful in that, among other kind of political concerns that his constituents had, is that his candidate also had hundreds of thousands of dollars. And really, I think, broke the $1 million mark as well. So the idea here is just to make it so that candidates can actually successfully run with small money. Now, people will say, where exactly does that money come? Like, if they're raising $175, then it's being matched by a public fund, like that's a lot of money. And we certainly hear that frequently. We did the numbers, and again, I'm going to stick just with Chicago. Chicago, because I have the ordinance in my head, but in Chicago, it costs less than 0.1% of the budget, and we've seen several different studies showing that if, for example, an alderman or a mayor does not take a large donation from a specific contractor or from a specific business, then future dealings of that city will actually save a lot of money because it'll be a more open process. Instead of feeling like, well, I raised $10,400 from this one small business, they have to get the permit that they want. We always thought that the people who wouldn't like this would be businesses, and that is actually not true at all. So there was a study done of a survey done of Illinois businesses this past July, and we knew that this survey was happening. We weren't excited with the results because we thought that they were all going to say that they would not be supportive of a small donor match program, and overwhelmingly they are supportive of it. And in the comments section, they said over and over again, from the largest corporations to the small mom and pop shops, that they are tired of having to play this game. They don't like giving $10,400 to a candidate every time. That's their business. They want to keep that money. They want to reinvest it into their own business, but they feel like they have to do that, otherwise they're not going to get the permit that they need. They're not going to be able to get the support that they need. They're not going to have the access that they need. As part of this campaign, we have worked to meet with all 50 aldermen. We probably actually met with about 45. And the difference in access, whether you're a donor or not, is massive. We could kind of intuitively think that probably if you're a donor, you're going to have more access. If you're not a donor, you're probably going to have less access, and that's fairly obvious. I didn't realize how big of a concern it was. There are some elected officials that will schedule a meeting with their constituents, no problem, within a couple weeks. There are others who we have called every single week for 6 months to schedule a meeting, and we're never able to get it. This is with their constituents. It's not just us as an organization, but our members that live within their district. And nothing, and nothing, and nothing. And then I had a conversation with someone who I knew was a donor of this particular elected official and said, hey, we've been trying for 6 months to get a meeting. Can you see if there's anything that you can do? And we had a meeting within 48 hours. That's a problem, right? Because the majority of people can't give $10,400 to a candidate. The majority of people, even if they can give that money, don't want to give all of that money to a political candidate just to be able to walk into their office and have a conversation about an issue that's important to them. So we see this as a great way to give a voice to everyday Illinoisans, and it's great because we have, we already have the examples to pull from. Again, at the Constitutional Convention, no one knows what's happening. So everyone disagrees on what it would actually mean. But for fair elections, we've seen it in New York City, we've seen it in Los Angeles, we've seen it in I think Colorado is one of the cities, and a lot of other ones that have had this in place. We kind of started from a narrative point of view out in Chicago, but we would like to one day bring to other municipalities as well as eventually have a statewide program. Because this is really one of the only effective ways that we have to guarantee that small money is going to matter outside of overturning Citizens United, which unfortunately we only have so much control over. One of the things that I wanted to touch base on, and then we can move to the Q&A session. So I'm here to talk about land politics, right? But Common Cause Illinois, as an organization, has also worked very hard on same-day voter registration and automatic voter registration. So same-day or election day registration has been a big issue for us. We were able, with many other organizations, to pass that back in 2014, and last March was the first time that we actually had the system in place. And I personally thought that maybe 5,000 or 10,000 people would register to vote on election day. 110,000 people registered to vote on election day in Illinois. A little over 110,000 people. Huge numbers. Particularly here on campus was one of the largest concentrated areas of same-day or election day voter registration. It was a huge, great way for more people to get involved. And the only reason I added this slide, and we'll talk about automatic voter registration as well, is because this week it became very relevant. So everyone was excited, 110,000 people. Like, imagine what it's going to look like in the actual general election as well. That was just a primary. What a great way to get more people involved. But unfortunately, the organization filed a lawsuit against election day registration, and just this week, a judge has suspended election day registration for the upcoming election. Now, it's currently under appeal, so nobody knows exactly what's going to happen yet, but a federal judge, in the immediate short term, has stopped election day registration. And I bring this up because it's tied very closely to money in politics. When you look up the organization that did this, it's called the Illinois Policy Institute, and their political arm is the Liberty Something Center. And they are a part of the State Policy Institute, which is a national conglomerate of different organizations in every single state that challenge laws like these. And when you look at their funding, they have been funded by independently wealthy billionaires and particularly have ties to Alec and Koch brothers. And so what we've seen here is a bunch of policy fees coming in after something that has been passed by the House and the Senate. So the House and the Senate came together and the governor signed it back in 2014. Over 110,000 people used it. It was so clear that people were interested in this type of system. And then it was overturned. The argument was that the way it was written, in the lawmaking process, the goal was to get same-day voter registration everywhere. Because we want people to be able to register to vote on election day. Some of the county clerks for much smaller counties came back and said, hey, well, we just, because of how we're set up, we don't have electronic poll books, we don't have some of the pieces of technology, so like, we kind of have to have an exception there for our county just because of how it's set up, but we aren't able, we just aren't able to do that. And, there have been many other cases in Illinois law where some of the smaller counties are given some exceptions. So for places like Cook County, there was a requirement, I think Champaign County, there was a requirement that every polling place had election day registration. You would also see that, so you see that in Organic Champaign, you saw that in Rockford, you saw that in Chicago, and a lot of other places like that. But in some of the more rural places, they only had to have it in one location. So like their central location would still have to provide election day registration, but like not every polling place would have to because the county clerks came back and said that they couldn't implement it, it was not possible. That then set up this, group that's backed by big money to come out and say, well, see, this is to suppress the vote of rural voters. This is to keep rural people from voting. Was like the specific language that was used. And instead of saying, well, you have to have it everywhere, you have to let every single polling place have election day voter registration, the judge decided to completely eliminate it from all polling places. Now, this particular judge, hopefully we're going to be able to overturn. He has a very high overturn rate, and it's now being appealed by the Attorney General to the Seventh Circuit Court. But my point is that issues that we really, really care about are impacted by money policy. Every single issue that you care about, again, has some type of money policy, whether it's the environment, whether it's education, everything has some tie. One thing that we worked very hard on was automatic voter registration, and we actually had bipartisan support in the House and Senate here in Illinois. So there are 12 million people who did not vote in 2012 because of problems with their registration, and all the automatic voter registration did was said that if you went to the state, either at Driver Services, or if you were at another social service agency or another government agency that collected that data, and we proved that you're eligible to vote, so if your birth certificate or something similar, then you don't have to fill out a separate form to register. Right now, there are 2.2 million people in Illinois that are not registered to vote, but they are eligible to vote. And the 110,000 number from election day registration, first off, is great, but it also means that there are longer lines because you can only predict some, to a certain level, how many people are actually going to show up, right? And so a huge concern was that what if we have 100,000 people show up next time? We want to make sure that we don't have to do that and that we have automatic voter registration in place. We were able to get that passed again with unprecedented bipartisan support. Democrats and Republicans came together and supported this in a way that we really actually didn't even expect. And I put up there that President Obama visited the Illinois Capitol building, and he gave a speech. Automatic voter registration was one of the key pieces that he brought up, saying that let's make the land of Lincoln a leader in voting rights. Everyone was very excited about it, and the governor vetoed the bill. So now there are currently efforts to override that veto on November 15th. But again, we see another example where a lot of people on both sides of the aisle came together, and it was vetoed, which is certainly means the governor has the right to do. But it's difficult when it's a governor who spent $40 million on his own election. It's difficult when he poured many, many more $1 million into other races. Races that, frankly, the Republicans who are supportive of this in the House and the Senate also received money from him. This is a bipartisan idea, but there's only so much people can do when you disagree with a decision that, in this case, the governor, but in other cases, it could be the mayor. If they're self-funding or if they're funded by outside large moneyed interests, there's only so much that you can do. And so that's why I just wanted to kind of point that out to show this is just one example of how money politics impacts every single thing and every single issue that we care about. With that, I think we're ready to open up to questions. There is a microphone somewhere. I have been asked to repeat the question, so I will, and I've been told to remind everybody so that you have the microphone very close to your mouth.
I wanted to mention that in the Citizens United bill at the Constitution, at the court level, Supreme Court, they said it was a no-brainer that there would be transparency. And we know there hasn't been. There's been the impasse. So I don't know what they were thinking. I guess nobody was in the electoral process. But I wanted to know, since you ended on voter registration and stuff, do you know about Crosscheck? Crosscheck is a program that is sort of the brainchild of the Kurt. I'm forgetting his name now. He's Alec, the inspired guy from Kansas. He's the Attorney General there or something. He's in charge of voting, and they have this database that they're using to disqualify people. The best source on this is a journalist named Greg Pallas, and for some reason Illinois got into it. Because I just don't understand. They're being very secretive about their database. I don't know if Common Cause has a statement on this at all, but it really should be shouted from the rafters. So I wanted to give a shout out to that as well.
Yeah, definitely. In response to that, one thing that I learned while working on automatic voter registration was just how many concerns we currently have with the way that the voting database is built and maintained. This is actually one way that this became such a bipartisan issue, is because whether you're a Democrat or Republican, if you're a county clerk, you're seeing that we have voting lists that are not maintaining the way that they should be. So whether it's through programs like that are specifically working to push people out, or Illinois just became a member of AIR, which I can't remember exactly what it stands for at this point. But it works with other states around you to say, okay, here's this person with this exact name, this exact address, like this is the same person. They say that they have not moved and now registered to vote in Indiana, so we've confirmed our registered vote over there, so we'll deactivate registration over here. That makes a lot of sense. But we've seen for many, many years Illinois has actually only just now become a part of that. It's been in place in other states for years, so that's a huge issue.
I have two questions, actually. The first one is, years ago I remember reading about organizations pushing for giving candidates free airtime, like in the media. And so I wondered if this is something that's still talked about, is it realistic, that kind of thing. And the second question that I had was in regards to the clean elections and the fair elections programs. They sound like great ideas, but I was wondering if you could explain more about how those things would help eliminate the influence of the PACs. Because I could see them still being able to give money to a PAC, even though they're not giving it to the candidate.
That's right. So let me start with the second one, and I'll come back to the first one. So one of the largest frustrations that we have working at the city or state level is that there is only so much we can do, particularly around PACs, right? And so what we have seen is that it's not, while money in politics, or while money has a huge influence on who wins an election, it is not always the person with the most money in the PAC that does. Again, Governor Bush is a great example of this with $121 million compared to a very, very small amount of money that was raised by Trump. But actually, I don't know if he had a PAC. If he did, it would not raise a lot of money comparatively. So what we tell people when we talk about fair elections and clean elections is that this is not a silver bullet. It's not going to fix the problems that we run into with PACs. Frankly, there's nothing that we can do until we get either a constitutional amendment or the Supreme Court rehear the case, which is unlikely but possible if there are significant changes in the layout. Or what this does do, though, and we've seen it in cases, particularly in New York and LA, and hopefully we'll have more examples here soon. But let's keep it local. If we say Ken Duncan. He had, again, a total of about $5 million. His opposition had a total of about $2 million, I think, both of which is way too much money for a state house race, in my opinion. But he did not win, right? So he had more money, but the other person still had enough money to remain competitive. The goal of the fair election or clean elections program is just to make sure that candidates have enough money to actually be competitive and not necessarily be a lot of money. There's, for example, whoever politics are whoever runs against the next governor, or whoever runs for governor against our current governor, is not going to be able to outspend someone who's just independently wealthy, right? In the same way that right now, if Trump, who's independently wealthy, and put all his personal money into his campaign, Secretary Clinton can raise as much money as she wants, it's not going to get there. But if the other candidates at least have enough money to run a viable campaign, then we've seen those people winning before. But certainly it's not a silver bullet. I'm waiting for your first question, though.
It was about organizations in the past that I've read about.
For the airtime, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, so the question was, this idea of giving each candidate like different public airtime. I have not heard anything about it lately. I actually read something really interesting when Canada did it, and they, I guess Canada allowed many different people to, it was a low barrier, and I can't remember what it was, there's just a very humorous video of a party that's clearly not serious, putting out their primetime ad. But I think there are certain advantages. Really, anytime that we can look at a public broadcast and realize that that should be an opportunity for everybody to get their voice heard. So this, the most recent example of this was, I think it's Governor Gervais of the Libertarian Party, who was trying to be a part of the debates, right? So debates are supposed to be essentially this free advertisement for candidates, but they're going to have to answer some hard questions, but they're also going to be given an audience of 100 million people. And there are pretty strict restrictions to keep that to two parties. I believe the threshold is 15%, it goes around 10%. You would assume that if 10% of Americans are supportive, then you should have a chance to get your message out. But I have not heard anything about that lately.
If I understand correctly, if you're saying someone puts in a small amount of money, then it's added to 6 times. Where does that money come from?
Yeah, good question. So she was asking for the Fair Elections Program, where you have a 6-time match. We're proposing in Chicago, what they have in New York City. LA is a 4-times match. Some places start as a 1-time match. Where does that public money come from? So different states have done it in different ways. So New York City just directly tied it to the general fund. It was actually after a corruption scandal, and so there was a lot of interest in trying to make the election process work there. And that was just prioritized by the city because it was prioritized by everyday people coming together saying that this was worth the money. We have written into our ordinance in Chicago that a portion of that money would come from increasing the fines for campaign finance violations. Would also increase the lobbyist registration fees. There would be also voluntary checkboxes that people could donate in the same way. So in Arizona right now, when I pay taxes there, I can check a box and get like $10 of taxes free to the, I think it was the Clean Elections Commission is what it was called. There are a lot of different ways to do it. It just comes down to a question of priorities and how we make that a priority. The cost is so different, right? So in Chicago, to have an effective one, it could be anywhere, it could be up to $30 million for a full cycle. Because of how expensive races are. You have 50 organic races, the general cost of lemos is about $250,000. You want to make sure you have enough money in case a lot of people participate. And, that adds up pretty quickly, and when we add in the mayor, it skyrockets. Where elections aren't as expensive, so a good example would be here. Rockford is another good example. You can do it with a relatively small amount of money. And so what we've seen is that, particularly in the smaller areas, the burden isn't as high, but also it's important to note that while sometimes it's difficult to quantify, when you're getting folks in office that are not beholden to particular contractors or corporations, then some of that money is saved in city contracts afterwards.
Some of that money is what?
It is saved because of how city contracts are put together afterwards, and not beholden to a particular organization.
Yes, thank you. The media landscape is changing so fast, especially with streaming, with mobile media, especially when you look at the millennials and how they consume information. Do you think in some way the advent of social media mitigates in some way the advantages that big money may have and allow candidates with less resources, at least a kind of a level playing field when it comes to their ability to compete?
Yeah, so the question was, given the advent of social media, particularly around millennials, does that in some way kind of offset some of the larger money because people are more connected in that way? which is a great question, and I think there are cases of that happening, right? So people who generally want to get a huge amount of attention could potentially go on social media. We've seen that happen with candidates relatively recently as well. People get really excited. And particularly, you know, some of the traditional media doesn't reach millennials. So like I identify as a millennial, and I did not see a single political ad until football started. And then when football started, it was the only time that I watched TV, or like regular TV, I keep seeing the same ads over and over and over and over. So I think there are two answers. One, campaigns are getting very good at using social media as a tool, and that does cost money. President Obama's 2008 campaign and then 2012 campaigns have been kind of the shining examples of that, where they put a huge amount of money into data and targeting specific people on social media. I think there's certainly the influence of money is a problem, even in kind of the social media age. But certainly by being more interconnected, we're able to have candidates that might not have as much money rise quickly. The one last piece that I would add is that the issue, if you look at my Facebook feed, you don't get opinions that I disagree with, right? So I like the pages that I like, and I unfollow the people that keep saying racist things. And that's kind of, so I just have like my own echo chamber. And so sometimes it's a problem because when we look at difficulties coming together and having bipartisan solutions, on my social media I'm not necessarily seeing bipartisan solutions, I'm seeing my opinions.
Perhaps I could ask you to comment on 3 areas. First of all, public acceptance of the idea of public funding. Secondly, a possible distinction between corporations and private individuals, which is brought to mind by what I believe was the historical position of the ACLU, that money equals speech.
Yeah, so I'll start with the second one, and then I'll forget the first one and ask you again. So first around like the money equals free speech, like we think it's hard to even give a good coherent response to that because it's just ridiculous. The fact that somebody who has $1 billion should have $1 billion more, a billion multiplied voice than someone who has $1 is just ridiculous. We believe that it should be one person to vote. We believe that it should be very easy to vote. And we believe there should be as much information out there as possible for people to decide who they want to vote for. I think small donor match programs go a long way of getting towards that solution, but I don't think that at this point with Citizens United and this idea that either corporations are people or that money is free speech, the more that we look at it, it just gets us farther away from one person, one vote, which is the cornerstone of our democracy. Can you repeat the first question?
Public acceptance of the idea of public funding.
So the question was about how does the public feel about public funding? And I will say that it is a cultural thing. So in New York City, it came about because of a big corruption scandal, and there were a certain number of people who were supportive of it, and they had a decent number of candidates who ran on it, so about 30% or something like that, which was great. But in the 30 years since then, now 91% of candidates in the 2015 primary ran using that system, and it's just a part of their political culture now. There's an expectation that you run in that transparent public way, and if you don't, you are going to be hunted by questions saying, well, why don't you do this? Why are you reporting to other people? So it's a cultural piece. LA was the same way. When it first started, there were mixed thoughts, and then as the program was in place for longer, people were more supportive of it and willing to put more resources into it. As we right now, a lot of people are canvassing in Chicago and just talking to voters about it. And some of the same questions come up that have come up here. Well, it's not going to fix super PACs, right? We can't fix super PACs. That's a huge concern. Or it costs money, and we want to share everything. Or obviously, there's education that's important to everyone, public safety, and so it's a balance of finding that. But the longer that the system is in place, the more supportive people are of it. And so you kind of have to wait for that cultural shift. Unfortunately, Chicago is 20 to 30 years behind that in the big cities. But hopefully, if we can see some progress there and then move that across the state of Illinois, we can start to see that cultural shift.
On the issue of redrawing legislative districts so that they're less gerrymandered and county powers got involved in that, how's the money been
Yeah, so redistricting is a really interesting case. So again, I come from Arizona, which has an independent redistricting commission, and I think that it's worked very well. So you see what on the presidential level is a very red state, but actually when you break it down, it's a pretty bipartisan state. And because of how the districts are drawn by the independent commission, you see a huge number of Democrats and Republicans running competitive elections and people having more of a say. Certainly, it's not a good idea when the elections are competitive, because then you can have all one person and vote that you want, it's not going to matter. Common Cause Illinois was supportive of the independent maps, as well as other redistricting solutions, and continues to be supportive of redistricting solutions. Independent maps was recently struck down by the courts and will not be allowed on the ballot, so that campaign had worked to get a little over 500,000 signatures, which is almost double the amount needed to get on the ballot. But the Illinois Constitution is written in a way that it's very, 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 very difficult to actually get us like a citizen referendum on the ballot statewide. So there's not really a way to do it in that sense. The only remaining option is legislative, which is obviously very difficult because in the same way that for fair elections, we're frequently asking people who have to take big money to support a system that's going to change how that works. We have to ask Democrats and Republicans to come together in the state house and the state senate and agree to redraw lines that frequently help them, right? That they're drawn in that way for a reason. It's interesting because it's not as partisan of an issue nationwide. It just tends to be whichever party is in power is less supportive of redistricting, whichever party is not in power is more supportive of it. But they're also concerned with how legislation is written and how redistricting would be created. So we were supportive of independent maps, but a lot of organizations, including the Chicago Arts Committee and I believe the ACLU, were not supportive because they felt like there were not strong enough protections to make sure communities of color still were represented.
It seems to me that this whole idea that money in politics is free speech is really stretching logic beyond belief. You can make a case, it seems to me that's a stronger one, that a lot of money in politics leads to a lot of corruption in politics. You can show analytically that $1, one vote leads to larger public budgets than one person, one vote leads to larger public budgets than $1, one vote. That leads to smaller, public budgets. So, court that is quite conservative is likely to use this very distorted logic that this is free speech. Don't you really think that the most realistic way of changing this whole situation is, put it bluntly, if Hillary gets elected and appoints somebody to the Supreme Court that makes the court, somewhat more liberal? The problem is, I know Gervais is working hard for an amendment, and Tom Crosby, I'm in favor of that. It is a very long, very difficult process, and unlikely to happen, perhaps. It seems to me that the most realistic way of getting a change is through the political process. I wonder what you think about that.
Well, certainly the Supreme Court, the reason we call it Supreme, right, it's going to have a huge amount of influence whoever the next president is, and that's why we think it's so important to get out to vote. Obviously, we're nonpartisan organizations. We don't care who you vote for. We just think you should vote. But if you are looking at this from a money politics point of view, I think it's really important to look at the candidates in the upcoming election and see who is going to be supportive of these, of getting rid of big money and trying to limit expenditures and trying to make sure that there's more transparency. Because the next president will have the opportunity to probably nominate between 2 and 3 people for lifetime commitments to the Supreme Court. And I certainly think that the next Supreme Court, money in politics is one of the biggest issues that we're going to see continue coming to the Supreme Court over the years. And so it's incredibly important to make sure that we find out and where you fall on this and figure out which candidate is going to be most supportive.
So do you think, really my question is more general, unless there are any other ones. So So, like you said, is if there were a limit of $5 per contribution, and 1,000 people contributed, and then that person would get some sort of portion of public money, do you think that that might get sort of tangled at some point where somebody who really has no business running manages to get some basis of contribution, and then public money is going towards that? So it could be some sort of group that has some very distinct views, and then public money is contributing towards that. So sort of a way to, or wondering sort of if there would be any way to prevent that. And then on top of that, do you think that maybe instead of no big money in politics, or no huge public interest, or private interest being represented in politics, do you think maybe there might be a healthy medium where there could be some big money, maybe campaign contribution limiting? Because I feel like big money might be slightly more selective than, a huge pool of small contributions might end up representing something that doesn't really have that much public interest. There might be some sort of pro to big money, just slightly.
Well, and how it's currently written, right? If you look at the limits that are in place, I talked about them a little bit, but of $5,200 per candidate per second, that's big money, right? And that's a significant amount of money, and it can have a lot of say. The biggest problems are when you're not looking at $1,000 or $5,000 or $50,000 or $500,000. Suddenly, if somebody's able to get support from a PAC, and they're going to get, in the case of Governor Bush, $120 million, you can raise as much small money as you want.
Something that doesn't really have that much public interest. There might be some sort of pro to big money, just slightly.
Well, and how it's currently written, right? If you look at the limits that are in place, I talked about them a little bit, but of $5,200 per candidate per second, that's big money, right? And that's a significant amount of money, and it can have a lot of say. The biggest problems are when you're not looking at $1,000 or $5,000 or $50,000 or $500,000. Suddenly, if somebody's able to get support from a PAC, and they're going to get, in the case of Governor Bush, $120 million, you can raise as much